You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode 266. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Have you ever noticed that no matter how much you try, there are certain aspects of your practice, and probably things outside of your practice too, where no matter how hard you try, you find yourself procrastinating? If that sounds like you, I'm so glad you joined me here this week. Welcome. I'm giving you a giant virtual hug. Thank you for being here, because what you are describing, procrastination, is something that we all struggle with at some point or another in one domain or another. And what I'm excited to share with you this week and the next 2 weeks is a discussion, practical advice for ways that you can deal with procrastination in 3 very specific contexts where I see lawyers struggle. So if you're joining and you saw the title of this week's podcast episode, then you know that this week we're talking about docketing and procrastination, and those two together specifically. Next week, we are talking about procrastination and drafting. And what I mean by that is drafting where the project is something that has a long lead time. And instead of drafting piece by piece, week by week, you end up with this project that you're kind of pulling off at the last minute, right? Maybe you tell yourself this is where you do your best work, and that may be true. You may be extremely creative when time requires it, but maybe it's a pattern that you've noticed and you want to change a little bit. And then finally, in a couple weeks from now, we are going to be talking about procrastination and business development. So these are 3 areas where I see lawyers procrastinate. They tell me they procrastinate. They want help to not procrastinate. And so we're going to dive into each of these week by week. And each week, I'm going to help you understand the problem, because it's all procrastination, but it looks a little bit different in each of these scenarios. And I'm going to offer you a potential solution. I'm going to give you a tool to experiment with, which I think is fairly well calibrated to the nature of the problem. And if you so choose, you can spend the week, right, testing out the tool that I offer to see how it helps you with the flavor of procrastination. So I hope that that sounds like fun to you. I am so with you. If you are procrastinating, it probably isn't fun, and it probably is very frustrating. And so I completely get that. And what I'm trying to do is create an environment, this podcast, where we can talk about it. We can talk about what's going on, and you can feel validated. You can feel acknowledged, and you can feel empowered that the tool that you walk away with at the end of today is one that you can apply and hopefully achieve some of the results that you want, specifically not procrastinating when it comes to your docketing. So if you're here because you are struggling with docketing, then number 1, you're not alone. This is a challenge for so many lawyers, so many amazing, bright, talented lawyers. And what you'll probably find is that if you are procrastinating when it comes to doing your dockets, then you may have some challenges in terms of people getting upset with you, right? If you have people who are saying, listen, you need to be more on top of your docketing, you may be upset with yourself because you're not on top of your docketing. It may create some tension around payroll, or not necessarily payroll, but just in terms of the processing of the firm invoices and all those sorts of things. And so this is an area where when you're struggling, it becomes something that may not just involve you. I mean, if it's your own firm, I mean, even then, right? If it's your own firm, if you're not on top of the invoicing, then you're probably going to need to get on top of it, right? Because you need to get paid at some point. And if you're in an organization, a law firm, for example, where they are responsible for taking care of the billing, etc., they want you, they need you to play your part, right? There is a true need, a true mathematical requirement that the time be entered in order for the invoicing system to work. So this is one of those problems where if it's something that is present in your practice, you're probably really noticing it, and people around you are probably really noticing it as well. And you may be a lawyer listening to this podcast episode, and you're here, you're relating to what we're talking about. If you know anybody who could use support, you may want to share this episode with them as well. And if you're listening to this episode because you're thinking about how you can support other lawyers who are struggling, then I'd encourage you to reach out to me. I can help with that, right? I can help figure out how to support the lawyers in your organization, whether it's through coaching, whether it's through speaking and training. This is something that is so common. And so I just want you to know you're not alone. And there are ways to absolutely create better systems and have more support and feel more able, right? More capable, more able, more willing to deal with these dockets. So just to be clear, when I'm talking about docketing, I'm talking about the act of transcribing, right? If we get down to what the thing is that is being procrastinated or pushed off. So if this is you, this is where you are procrastinating, is likely in the moment where you have completed your work, right? This may be at the end of the day. This may be as you go through your day. You've completed the work, right? So in your mind, you have a task that you've just done, right? You might think of the written description on your time entries, right? Reviewed draft argument, submitted draft argument, filed argument with the court. I mean, you're probably not docketing the filing of, but the work in preparation of the filing itself. You might be thinking about a conversation with client to discuss options, advising client on next best steps, review documents for relevance and privilege. I mean, there's all sorts of things that you might be putting in your time entries. And so that's one component of docketing. And of course, the other component of docketing is assigning a time value, 0.1, 1.3, 7.6, depends on what you were doing. So translating that information from your brain onto a sheet of paper. Maybe you're doing them by hand, a little bit old school, but it works. Maybe you're entering your time into a system. Maybe you have timers going on and you need to close a timer and put a little caption in there. It really depends on the system that you're using. But there is this moment in time where you are transcribing from your brain into some other form of record keeping your build time, right? That is what I'm talking about today when we're talking about docketing. There may also be a point where you're submitting your entries electronically. They go from your domain into the domain of the firm or organization where you work. And so that might be another transition point for you. But what we want to get clear about today is how do we go from having that information in our head to actually putting that information where it gets used, where it can now be part of the firm's billing system. So how do lawyers get stuck? Now, when you struggle with procrastination, generally, one of the challenges that you are facing is the challenge of translating knowledge into skill. So we all have access to knowledge. I would say unlimited knowledge at this point if you're relying on AI, right? Well, maybe not unlimited. There's probably things that even AI would not be able to figure out, but there really is this limitless source of knowledge out there, but we have access to a lot of it. So knowledge typically isn't the problem. If you're listening to this episode, you probably know that you should enter your time, right? You probably tell yourself that. You probably understand why entering your time contemporaneously is better than saving up all your time until the end of the month, right? But you still aren't actually executing it. And this is where skill becomes more relevant, right? There's knowledge and there's skill. And skill is the applied application. It is you doing, executing, actually implementing the knowledge that you have. It's you taking that information from your mind and putting it into some external record. That's where we typically have a challenge. And so everything that we talk about when we're talking about moving away from procrastination into action is we're developing a skill that once we get really good at that skill, we're better at action taking. So if we start with docketing then, and this week we're focused on docketing, as I mentioned, we'll have other focuses in the next weeks to come. If we look at docketing, let's look at the nature of what that problem is, right? Docketing itself is a fairly discrete and daily task. It's something that you know you should do, but for whatever reason, you're not doing it. And so what we want to think about is like, what does that exactly look like, right? The task itself is one that you know you need to do, basically daily, but there's not necessarily a sense of accountability, right? In the sense that there may not be somebody who's monitoring your daily time entries, but maybe you need to be accountable at the end of the month because that's when invoices are calculated and sent out. And certainly at the end of the year, right? So you'll often see that there is a real push for lawyers at the end of a month to get their time entries in, right? We all know those lawyers who spend perhaps the last few days of each month putting together their month's work and doing their best to get their timesheets in, right? And same thing at the end of the year, right? That's a little bit of a different issue often, right? It's not necessarily getting in the time entries. It may be that there's not enough time in those entries because of perhaps an uneven distribution of workflow throughout the year, et cetera. And so lawyers will often be really struggling November, December to make sure that they're meeting their targets at the end of the year. So going back to the nature of the problem then is this thing that happens daily and we need to keep on top of it. And if we don't keep on top of it, then we know it's going to be punctuated by these month-end senses of urgency where you're scrambling to get your time in. Now, an analogy that might work here is flossing your teeth, right? You know that if you floss your teeth daily, right, that you will have healthy gums, ideally, and that when you go to your hygienist once every 6 months or 4 months, if you're me, then you're not going to get lectured for having not flossed your teeth for the last 4 to 6 months. Now, when I was younger and foolish, younger and just less concerned about my gums, I used to be very terrible about flossing. I would not do it daily. I would do it in the weeks leading up to my visit with my hygienist, right? Much like some of you may be leaving your timesheets to the last few days of the month. And I would hope that those few days or weeks of flossing would kind of get me to a good enough state that my hygienist would not lecture me, right? It didn't always work. That's an equivalent, right? It's a task that maybe you don't want to do, but you know you need to do it. So what's happening here often, right? If you're not doing your time entries on a regular basis, is that there's some sort of internal narrative that is going on that is preventing you from doing your time entries. So I've got 3 flavors of stories that you may be telling yourself, and I would encourage you to think about which story resonates the most. And if none of these stories really resonates, then what is the story that is keeping you from actually recording your time? So, example number 1, you're telling yourself that recording your time entries feels tedious, right? You can imagine you are midday and you've just completed a project and you think about doing your time entries and you think, I just don't want to do that. I want to move on to the next task. Or it's the end of the day and you've worked hard all day and you're completely exhausted. And just thinking about doing your time entries feels even more exhausting. And you end up feeling this deep sense of dread, right? It's almost like a full body, no, I'm not going to do my time. No, I'm going to do it some other time. So instead of actually just completing the docketing, instead of getting it over with, you decide you're going to leave for the day, right? This could be at your home office. It could be at work. You decide you're going to do this later when you're feeling less tired and you walk away from the task. You don't do it. Too much dread. You're too exhausted. You step away. Now, another reason why you might be avoiding your docketing is, and there's a couple that are interestingly related, or they're both about the amount of time, I should say, that you're spending on a task. So the first of those is when you think that you have spent too long on a given task. So the story that you're telling yourself here is you took too long on a given task. You are entering a 7.2 and you feel like it really should have been a 3.6. If you were a more competent lawyer, if you were faster, if you were smarter, if you were more like that lawyer down the hall from you, then you would have done this task in a fraction of the time. And so you're feeling like you really cannot record this full amount of time. It feels wrong to you. It might bring up feelings of self-doubt, right? That maybe you lack competence, that you're not fast enough, that other people are going to see this time entry and they're going to judge you. They're going to think that you're not smart enough, that you're not fast enough. They're going to wonder how it's possible that you spent that much time on your file. You might be thinking about your clients, right? The end person who's going to receive the invoice. And are they going to question why it took you so long to do a certain task? And so this can create feelings of anxiety, feelings of fear, feelings of self-doubt. So you can see that this act of entering your time, which in itself is fairly mechanical, is difficult, not because it's hard to type the numbers in your keyboard. It's hard because of what you're telling yourself it means about you. So this is another area where the challenge here, right? The reason for procrastination is the story, the way that you're describing the events to yourself. You're telling yourself that it's taking you too long. That is a problem. And that is a problem because. Now, the third example, a very common thought that a lawyer may have, you may have when entering your time, is the opposite of too much time, and that is not enough time. So you can imagine you sit down and it's time to do your time entries. Let's say it's the end of the day and you've been at work, whether at home or at the office, say a period of about 10 hours. So it's been 10 hours and you go to enter your billable time and you see that the number of hours that you're recording is much less than that. Maybe it's a 2.3. Or a 4.7. And you think, how is it possible that I've been here for this long and I've only captured that much time? And again, you might find that you're entering into this narrative. And the narrative isn't one of positive self-talk, right? It's more like, how is it possible? How did I waste the day, right? You might be thinking, this is a waste of time. I'm so bad at managing my time. I'm really frustrated because I have been here for so long and yet I have nothing to show for it. So you can see that there's a narrative that you're telling yourself, right? I should have more time on my timesheet. I was too distracted today. I didn't manage my time very well. I wasn't very efficient. Maybe you're receiving work that is hard to bill, right? Those files where there's a lot of non-billable tasks associated with the file. Maybe you're getting a disproportionate number of those types of files. And so you're finding it's really hard to even have work on your plate that is billable. Maybe you have billable work on your desk, but you were really distracted or you were concerned about something or somebody stepped into your office and they started talking and you weren't able to find a way to let them know that what you really needed to prioritize was your billable work. So there's all these things, all these stories that you may be telling yourself that are related to this fact that the number of hours on your timesheet is lower than what you were hoping for. You're entering less time than what you were hoping for. And again, this might lead to feelings of frustration, of maybe self-doubt, that you're doubting your ability to manage your time. It might be resentment that you're receiving these projects that are so hard to turn into billable work. It may be that you're struggling with boundaries around having limits with people so that you can actually focus on the work that you need to do during the day. So you're seeing here, right, that this story is creating these feelings. It's almost like you don't want to write it down because that makes it real. And as a result, you push it off, thinking that at some point in the future, you'll feel more confident, you'll feel better, you'll feel less frustrated, and you'll be ready to put that time down on the timesheet. And that may be true. You may be less attached the following day, but you're also creating more work for yourself the following day. So what you'll see here, if you've been following with what I've been saying, maybe you're nodding your head at parts because you're thinking, yeah, I can totally see that. Then what you realize is there's a pattern here, right? You're seeing how there's this idea that you're sitting in the moment. You know you could enter your time. You want to enter your time. You want the docketing to be done and behind you, but you procrastinate because of the way that you're talking to yourself and the way that you're feeling, right? The examples we used, it feels too tedious. You feel like you took too long on a task, or you feel like you don't have enough time to show for the day that you spent at work. And so you procrastinate, you avoid, you push it off to some point in the future when you think you might feel more inclined to do it. But the reality is there's never really a time where you feel great about it. So the solution here, I am going to offer you a single approach. There are multiple ways we can approach procrastination, but I'm offering the approach here that I would start with if you were my client and we were wanting to start to get some traction over this, is we want to understand the story that you are telling yourself, because that is the beginning point where we can start to unpack what is happening, the reason for the procrastination, and start to find ways to overcome it. So there's 2 steps that I'm going to ask you to follow this week. Number 1 is simply to notice the narrative that you are telling yourself. So when you sit down, if you are struggling with your dockets, I would love for you to notice the story that you are telling yourself. Maybe it's, this is tedious. Maybe it's, I can't believe how much time that took. So-and-so down the hall would have done this in half the time. I cannot put this on my timesheet. I'm going to have to come back to this another time and decide how much time that I'm actually going to put down. Or maybe it's that, you know what, I can't believe I've been here for so long and I've only got this much to show for it. So we're going to notice what the narrative is. And maybe it's something completely different. As you're listening today, I'm hoping that you're thinking about what that could be for you. That's step one. And then next, step two is to experiment with a different narrative, right? So if you're thinking about the challenge that you're having, the narrative that you're telling yourself, there is another perspective that you would be able to take when it comes to entering your time. Now, I cannot tell you specifically what that would be for you because it's going to be different depending on the initial narrative that you are telling yourself. But what I would encourage you to experiment with is to try different narratives that you think might work for you and see where you start to get some traction. Now, you want your narrative to feel true. So if you're telling yourself that time entry is tedious and you start telling yourself time entry is fun, chances are you're not really going to have that stick because you're going to tell yourself that you are telling yourself lies and this is a ridiculous exercise. Why are you doing it? So you want to focus on some other aspect of it, right? Maybe it's time entry is tedious, but I know that it's going to be less tedious now than it will be tomorrow. And I'm willing to take a crack at it. Maybe it's something like that. Or maybe it's time entry is tedious, but I know it will only take me 5 minutes and I can do anything for 5 minutes. So again, we just want to think about what the narrative is and is there a way around that? Now, what I have noticed and what you may also notice as you go through this exercise over the week is that often the narrative that we tell ourselves, the fact that this is difficult, is a reflection of something else that is going on as well, right? So if you look at tedious, it may be that the way that you're entering your time, the way you're doing your dockets, there may be a way of doing it that is actually less tedious, right? There might be an app you can use, a system you can use. If you're exhausted, it might be the time of day, right? Maybe after the day is all done, maybe that isn't the best time for you to enter your time, but maybe you've got a really great way of tracking your work and doing it first thing in the morning when you're fresh, right? Maybe there's another way you can take that tedious exercise and make it more fun, right? You can pair it with your after work wrap up where you're reflecting on your day and what you want to plan for your next day, right? That might make it, maybe it's not less tedious, but it feels really productive. So you want to play with that, right? If you're thinking that you have too much time on your timesheets, maybe there's something there. Maybe there's self-doubt. Maybe there's a confidence issue at play, right? Where you're not feeling confident about the execution of your work. And maybe that's an area where we can have a conversation so that you feel more confident about those hours that you're putting on your timesheet. If there's not enough time and it's because you're distracted or because you're receiving work that is simply hard to bill, right? There's so much admin there. Maybe there's a conversation that you'd like to have with the lawyers at your firm, the clients that you're working with about the type of things that you need in terms of your work, right? What your capacity is, maybe setting some boundaries around the types of work that you're going to do. So there's work there, right? There's often something behind the scenes. So what's so incredible about procrastination and doing this type of exercise is, yes, you get to solve that immediate problem. And you also get to gain so much awareness of what is going on behind the scenes where there's more opportunities to tweak and make shifts and changes so that the act of entering the time is no longer so painful, right? If you were entering consistently time that you felt good about, maybe that exercise wouldn't feel like something that you wanted to push off. So that's what I have for you today. A couple more things before we wrap up. Number one is if you are looking for ways to reframe the way that you think about docketing, then I'd encourage you to go back to a podcast episode that I recorded back at number 230. It's a podcast episode about making friends with the billable hour. So that might be a really neat next step for you in terms of just thinking about different ways that you can characterize docketing, think about docketing, and possibly make friends with docketing, right? That might be a helpful resource for you. I've also got a couple of free downloadable resources that might be of interest. One of them is creating a protocol for procrastination. So you'll find a link to that with the show notes with this episode. That gives you some prompts so that you can start to think about a strategy that you could put into play when you feel like procrastinating. And then also I've got a podcast roadmap and it traces through the numerous episodes I've recorded about time management, including episodes specifically about procrastination and episodes specifically about docketing. And that might give you some more leads in terms of how you can support yourself when it comes to getting your dockets done and getting your dockets done on time. And then Finally, if you want to reach out to me directly, I would, of course, love to support you with this. So if this is something that you're struggling with personally, then feel free to reach out. Send me an email, send me a DM on LinkedIn. I would love to hear from you, and we can set up a call and we can talk about the ways in which I can help you deal with procrastination, whether it's docketing or some other aspect of your practice. We can look at what's going on at a surface level. And if you want, we can look at what else is going on, what other systems we might put in place to support you with time management. Now, if you are looking to support another lawyer, right? I mentioned that at the beginning, right? You might think about sharing this episode with them, or you might think about reaching out to me, and I can share with you ways in which I could potentially support you, whether it is providing one-to-one support for that lawyer, whether it's coming in and doing a discussion, a presentation about time management. Maybe it's really specific to docketing. I'd love to help you with that. So with that, I'm going to extend that invitation and welcome any inquiries you have on this topic. And I'm going to thank you for being here today. Thank you so much for investing the time today to talk about docketing, to talk about procrastination, how the two go hand in hand, and how you can use the exercise of taking the thoughts, the perspective, the narrative that you have around docketing and try on a new narrative that will help you to initiate that task and do it more consistently and in a more timely way. So I'm excited for you to try this out this week. I will be back next week, and I'm hoping you'll be back too, to talk about another area where I see lawyers really struggle with procrastination, and that is drafting, and specifically drafting where the project that you're working on, the thing that you are drafting, is probably relatively complex and has a long lead time, right? It's not urgent, but it's important. And so we're going to talk about what's happening there and a specific tool you can use to help yourself in that situation. So thanks again for joining. I'll see you next week. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.